I walked into that mountain cabin with a plan in my head, a sharp knife on my belt, and a rifle that smelled like gun oil from my last cleaning. The year was 2012, late October, and the season was already cold in northern Wyoming. I had driven up the dirt road for almost 2 hours, with endless pine trees pressing against the narrow path, their shadows stretching over the windshield like long fingers. I thought I came here for a quiet hunting weekend, maybe to track mule deer. What I found instead filled every moment with a kind of slow fear that felt heavier than the night around me. When I first pulled up, the cabin looked empty, like it hadn't been used for weeks. There was an old truck parked near the trees, covered in pine needles and dust, like someone had abandoned it there. I figured the owner probably left it and hiked deeper into the woods. The cabin itself was built from dark wood, low and slightly crooked, with a tin roof that rattled in the wind. My boots crunched over old leaves as I walked up to the door. I noticed claw marks on the side wall, long and uneven, like something had scraped at the wooden boards. At the time, I assumed it was from a bear or maybe a mountain lion. I tried not to think too much about it. Inside, the place smelled like old smoke. There were dead flies gathered in the window corners, piles of dust, and a thin layer of cold air hanging above the floor. I dropped my backpack and set my rifle by the small table, telling myself that I had been in worse places. I lit the small propane heater that sat against the wall and tried to settle in, but the silence outside felt too wide, like the woods were holding their breath. After eating a simple meal, I decided to walk the property and check for signs of deer. The daylight was sinking fast behind the ridges, and the air felt thin against my face. The forest floor was covered in a mix of pine needles and patches of early snow that crunched under every step. About 100 yards behind the cabin, I found tracks. They weren't deer though. They looked more like boot prints, fresh ones. They led deeper into the woods and then stopped near a fallen log. I stood there staring at empty ground, trying to understand why someone's tracks would end like that. The soil looked disturbed, like someone had stood there for a long time. I couldn't hear anything but wind moving through the trees. I didn't like the idea of turning my back on that spot, but it was getting dark and the temperature was dropping fast. I headed back and locked the door behind me. During the night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing something moving outside. Not fast, just slow steps on old leaves. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or some stray elk. But the sound had a pattern, like someone walking in a circle around the cabin. The floor felt cold under my feet, even with the heater running. At some point, the noise stopped and I finally drifted into a light sleep. In the morning, frost covered the windows. I stepped outside and saw something that pulled the air straight out of my lungs. There were new boot tracks in the dirt, circling the cabin exactly once. They were close, way too close, almost brushing the wooden walls. Whoever walked around the cabin last night had been right next to me while I lay in bed. I checked my rifle right away, making sure it was loaded, and I felt the cold metal of it like a kind of comfort, even though my hands shook a little. I followed the tracks for a short distance, but they faded into the trees like they just disappeared. Every sound in the forest that morning felt sharp, like the snap of a branch was warning me. I decided to hunt anyway, believing maybe it was another hunter passing through, maybe even the owner of the truck. I moved deeper into the woods, moving slow, listening for any sign of animals. I found some deer droppings and scraped dirt under low branches, but the forest felt too quiet. After 2 hours, I hadn't seen anything worth shooting, but I kept going until I reached a ridge that overlooked a narrow valley. That's when I saw smoke, a small line coming up through the trees maybe a mile away, thin and white like someone was trying not to be noticed. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here, at least not this far from the county road. I stood there for a long minute staring at that thin smoke. I felt something in my stomach tighten, but part of me wanted to know what was there. I moved down the slope carefully, but halfway there I heard something that stopped me cold. A metal sound like a shovel hitting a rock. Slow, steady, and deep like someone digging. I crouched behind a fallen tree and stayed there, listening. The shovel sound continued, steady, like whoever it was didn't care about being quiet. I never reached that smoke. Something in me told me to turn around and go back the way I came. The whole forest suddenly felt like it was watching me move. On my way back, I heard branches snapping behind me, spaced out, almost like footsteps mirroring mine. I didn't run, but I walked faster, my heart beat loud in my ears. When I finally reached the cabin, I closed the door, locked it, and moved a chair against it. The wind pushed against the walls and the sky turned gray like snow might fall. I stayed inside for hours, just listening and watching the tree lean through the dusty window. As the evening settled in, I finally saw movement. Not an animal, a person standing still behind the closest line of trees. I could only see a dark coat and the shape of a hood. The figure didn't move toward the cabin, just stood there, facing my direction. Couldn't see a face. I felt my hands shaking again, and I kept my rifle ready the whole time. Eventually, the figure stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I didn't go outside. I waited until darkness swallowed the woods again. I barely slept that night, sitting in a chair, rifle across my lap, the heater hissing softly beside me. Early morning light crept in through the window, and for a moment I almost convinced myself none of it happened. But then I saw something new. A small piece of paper was stuck under a rock just outside the door. My stomach knotted. I opened the door slowly and grabbed it while keeping my eyes on the tree lean. The paper had a simple pencil map drawn on it, showing the outline of the cabin and a spot marked with an X deeper into the woods. It looked like the same direction where I had heard digging. There were no words, nothing else. Just that. I dropped the paper onto the table and started packing. I didn't care about hunting anymore. I wanted to get out before snow trapped me up here. As I loaded gear into my truck, I heard something in the woods again, much closer this time. I didn't look. I just climbed into the truck and drove. Branches scraped the sides as I pushed through the narrow road, and every bump made the rifle rattle against the seat. About half a mile down the dirt road, I passed that old truck again. This time I really looked at it and noticed something I hadn't before. The windows were fogged from the inside, like someone had been sitting in it overnight. On the passenger floor, through the glass, I could see a shovel leaning against the seat. I kept driving, faster than I should have on that rough road. The trees eventually thinned out and the road connected with pavement. Only then did my heartbeat slow down enough to really think. For days after I got home, I kept replaying everything in my mind. I tried to make sense of who that person was, why they were out there, why they left that map. I even checked news stories from that area, thinking maybe someone went missing or police found something buried in the woods, but nothing showed up. I know what I heard, what I saw, and what I felt. There was someone out there watching the cabin, moving around it at night, digging somewhere deeper in the forest. Maybe hiding something, maybe taking something out. I'll never know. I never went back to that cabin. I don't plan to go back to that part of Wyoming at all. Every time I think about it, I see that person standing motionless between the pines, waiting until the light fades, circling the cabin while I slept, maybe listening to every breath I took. Nothing supernatural happened, nothing magical, nothing unbelievable. It was just a real person doing something in those woods that I never want to understand. That is what makes it so frightening to think about, because real people can be much worse than anything else we imagine, especially when you are alone in a place where no one would hear you if something went wrong. It was late autumn in 2012, and I had decided to take a short break from my life in Manchester. I needed a week to myself, somewhere quiet, far from the constant hum of traffic, deadlines, and the city's never-ending noise. I found a small cabin in the Northumberland countryside, close enough to be reachable by car, but isolated enough that I would have a real escape. The owner, an older man named Graham, insisted the place was perfect for solitude, but he mentioned in passing that the area could feel a bit lonely. At the time, I laughed it off. Lonely seemed exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long and narrow. The main roads gradually gave way to twisting lanes lined with thick hedgerows, their branches scratching against my windshield when the wind picked up. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was a deep, bruised gray, and the first drops of rain had begun to fall. The cabin itself was modest. Stone walls, a steeply pitched roof, and a small wooden porch that creaked when I stepped onto it. It had an almost forgotten feel, as if it hadn't been visited in months, maybe even years. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. Dust clung to every surface, and I spent the first hour wiping counters and sweeping the floors, trying to shake off that immediate sensation that the place had been abandoned. That night, after I set up a small fire in the fireplace, I felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. Relief because finally I was alone. Unease because the silence of the surrounding forest was absolute. No distant dogs barking, no cars passing by, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the long, low groan of a tree in the wind. I convinced myself it was nothing. I was just tired. I slept fitfully, waking once or twice to the sound of something tapping against the cabin's walls. In the morning, I found nothing out of place. No footprints, no damage, nothing that suggested an intruder. I shrugged it off and went for a walk along a narrow trail behind the cabin, following a small stream that wound through the trees. It was beautiful, almost picturesque in that overcast, autumnal way. The air smelled of wet earth and fallen leaves, sharp and fresh. I felt that rare kind of peace you only get in complete isolation. It wasn't until the third day that I first saw her. I was sitting on the porch with a thermos of tea, watching the rain drizzle through the branches, when I noticed movement at the edge of the trees. She was thin, with long, matted hair that looked dark even in the gray light, and she wore a long coat that seemed far too heavy for the damp weather. Her eyes, as she emerged from the shadows, were wide and unblinking. I froze. She didn't speak, didn't move toward me. She just stood there, staring. At first, I thought she might be another hiker or a neighbor from a nearby farm, though the nearest farmhouse was at least a mile away. When she didn't move, I tried to wave, but she didn't respond. After a few minutes, she turned and walked back into the trees, slow, deliberate, almost like she didn't want me to follow. My heart was pounding. I told myself she must live nearby. Maybe she was lost, maybe she was eccentric. But the unease didn't leave me. That night, I locked all the doors and windows before going to bed, though I had no real reason to. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of scraping. It was faint, like fingernails on wood, and it came from the porch. My first thought was that it was an animal, a fox, a badger, but the sound was deliberate, methodical. My stomach sank as I realized it wasn't random. Someone was outside. I stayed frozen in bed, listening. The scraping stopped after a few minutes, replaced by a soft shuffle, then silence. I told myself to stay calm, that I had imagined it, that the wind could have blown some branch against the porch. But when I peeked through the curtains, I saw her again. She was standing just beyond the edge of the porch light, partially hidden in the shadows. I could only see the outline of her figure, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring at the cabin like she had been waiting for me. I slept in bursts, never fully resting, and in the morning, the anxiety hadn't eased. I thought about leaving, but a storm had rolled in overnight, making the narrow roads slick and dangerous. I decided to stay another day, convincing myself it was safer than driving. During the day, I explored the surrounding area, hoping that by staying busy, I would stop thinking about her. The forest was dense, and the trail twisted in ways that made it easy to get turned around. At one point, I realized I had walked further than I intended. When I turned to retrace my steps, I saw her again. Standing at the edge of the trees, her posture rigid, her eyes locked on me. My first impulse was to run, but I froze. She didn't move. She just watched, and then she slowly stepped back into the shadows. That evening, I lit a fire again and tried to ignore the sounds outside. But then I noticed something on the porch, a crude, almost childlike drawing etched into the wooden boards. At first, I thought it was graffiti from someone else, but the symbol was unfamiliar, jagged, and chaotic, as if someone had scratched it with a sharp tool. I felt my hands shake as I examined it. It wasn't threatening in an obvious way, but it was deliberate and it was personal. Someone had been here, watching, and taking the time to mark the porch while I was inside. I spent the next hours barricading the doors with furniture, moving chairs against the windows. I kept a kitchen knife in my hand and sat by the fireplace, trying to calm my mind. Every rustle, every snap of a branch outside made my heart leap. I couldn't see her, but I could feel her. I could feel the weight of her presence, like she had wrapped the forest around the cabin and made it her own. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat, knife in hand, eyes fixed on the doorway, waiting. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a deliberate knock, slow and heavy, on the back door. My hands were trembling. I wanted to run, but I was trapped by fear. The knocking continued, slow and rhythmic. I finally whispered to myself that I had to confront it or I'd go insane. I grabbed my coat, flashlight, and knife and stepped onto the porch. The rain had stopped, and the forest was quiet. I shone the light into the darkness, and there she was, not moving, just standing there, staring. I raised my voice, demanding to know what she wanted, but she didn't respond. That's when I noticed something else. Small footprints in the wet earth, leading from the forest to the porch. Her boots were soaked, and they glinted in the flashlight beam. The next moment, she did something unexpected. She turned and walked slowly into the woods, leaving me standing on the porch, drenched, shaking, but alive. I didn't follow. I didn't watch. I just stood there until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. By midday, the rain had cleared completely. I packed my car and drove off, taking the main roads and avoiding the small lanes. I never saw her again, and when I returned the cabin a week later to Graham, I told him I had enjoyed the solitude but didn't mention the woman. In the weeks that followed, I realized something crucial. What terrified me wasn't her appearance or her presence. It was that she existed in my reality, fully human, fully alive, and fully capable of watching without interference. There were no supernatural elements, no explanations. Just a person who had chosen to inhabit the same space as me in a way I could neither predict nor control. Even now, over a decade later, I can't drive through the Northumberland countryside without feeling my chest tighten when the trees crowd close to the road. I can't pass a remote cabin without imagining someone standing in the shadows, silently observing, waiting. It taught me something about fear, about reality, and about the invisible boundaries people cross when they choose to. I left that cabin alive, but I also left a part of myself behind, my sense of absolute security. I learned that in some places, in some moments, the line between safety and danger is as thin as a shadow, and sometimes a shadow is all it takes. I remember the year as 2014, late autumn, somewhere along the dry border area between New Mexico and Mexico. I was 31 then, still trying to get used to living on my own again after leaving a job I had spent almost 9 years doing. I wanted a break from noise and people, so I rented a small old cabin that used to belong to a farmer who died a long time ago. The place looked forgotten, like most things near the border that were left behind when money moved somewhere else. The cabin stood about half a mile from the old dirt road that barely anybody used anymore. It sat in a patch of dry ground, cracked like broken skin, with weeds spreading around the walls. The roof had rusted metal sheets nailed down unevenly, and when the wind blew, they made a sound like something was trying to lift them up from inside. I didn't care about comfort. I just wanted silence, a place where I could breathe without hearing anything except wind and the occasional animal sounds. For the first 2 days, everything felt normal. I unpacked slowly, stored canned food in old cabinets, and set my sleeping bag on the floor since the bed frame was too broken to trust. The nights were colder than I expected for that part of the year, and I could smell the old wood through the sleeping bag. It had that dry smell that sticks inside your nose when you wake up. Around the third night, I heard something moving somewhere behind the cabin. It sounded like feet stepping on dry grass. Could have been a stray dog, because there were many of them around the border, abandoned by people trying to cross or by locals who just didn't care. I ignored it, but the sound didn't move away. It stayed near the back wall for at least an hour. I tried to convince myself it was an animal sleeping nearby. During the mornings, I walked around the property, counting the strange trash buried in dust. There were empty cans, rusted tools, broken bits of plastic, cigarette filters stuck in the dirt, and some pieces of clothing that looked like they had been there for years under the sun. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and most abandoned items around there belonged to people who tried crossing illegally. It wasn't rare to find backpacks, torn shoes, or small plastic containers. I tried not to think too much about who used to pass through that area. It didn't bother me until the 5th night. That night I woke up because something hit the cabin wall. It wasn't wind. It was a weight hitting wood, like a body leaning or falling against it. At first I stayed still, staring into the dark. The cabin didn't have electricity. I used a battery lantern, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I waited, breathing slowly, listening as the weight slid down the outside wall. In the morning, I went out and looked at the dirt around the wall. There were footprints. They were fresh. They were made by boots, not shoes. I tried to measure them with my hand width, and they looked about average size, maybe a man. The tracks came from the direction of the shallow valley south of the cabin. I forced myself not to panic because sometimes migrants pass through and maybe someone had wandered close without noticing the cabin. Still, something about it felt wrong. People crossing usually kept moving. They didn't stand outside a cabin at 2 in the morning. By the 7th night, I started sleeping with a heavy metal hammer next to me. It felt ridiculous, but holding something made me feel less exposed. That night, I smelled something outside, like smoke or burned trash. I waited and breathed through my mouth until the smell faded. I barely slept. During the next day, I walked farther south. I saw burnt remains of something that looked like a campfire but too black and thick, like someone burned plastic or something that wasn't meant for fire. I also found broken glass and a torn jacket half buried in sand. The sun felt sharper than usual, heavy on my neck. The air around that area always had a strange feeling, like the ground held memories of people who wanted to disappear. I never saw anyone, but I felt watched, like the silence had eyes. 2 more nights passed quietly. Then the 10th night came, a night I still remember clearly. The sky looked hazy, the moon almost hidden behind dusty clouds. The temperature dropped low, and my breath felt cold even inside the cabin. I was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind scrape the metal roof. Then I heard slow steps on the wooden porch outside. They were careful, controlled, not wandering like an animal. The steps moved across the boards and stopped right in front of the door. I held my breath, gripping the hammer, and I could feel my heart pushing against my ribs like it wanted out. The door didn't open, but I heard the soft sound of metal touching wood. I imagined someone testing the lock with something sharp. The door lock was old, weak, something you could break with one push if you wanted. I stayed completely silent for maybe an hour, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, the steps faded slowly into the night. I didn't sleep after that. I sat against the wall, watching the darkness creep through the small gaps in the boards. The next morning, I found marks on the door. Thin marks, like someone scraped it with a metal object. That confirmed everything I feared. Someone wasn't just passing by. Someone wanted to come in. I started thinking about leaving right away, but I felt stubborn, like I didn't want whoever it was to scare me out of the only quiet place I had found in years. So I stayed another night. That was a mistake. On the 11th night, I heard movement again, but not outside this time. I heard it inside the attic crawl space above me. The cabin had a small attic, but I never opened it. The hatch was in the corner near the front door, secured only by 2 small nails. When I heard the sound up there, I froze. It wasn't loud, just a soft shifting, like someone crawling slowly. I gripped the hammer and moved against the far wall. I remember staring at the hatch, waiting for it to move. It didn't open, but the crawling continued for almost 15 minutes, stopping sometimes, then continuing again like whoever was up there didn't care about being quiet. My body felt like it couldn't move, like fear pinned me down. When the noise finally stopped, I waited another hour before even breathing normally. To first light, I packed everything. I decided I had enough. I opened the front door slowly and stepped outside, scanning everything. The air was cold and silent. Then I saw boot prints near the back of the cabin again. Only this time they were heavier, deeper, like someone had been standing there for a long time. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I walked fast toward where I had parked my truck near the dirt road. My hands were shaking when I unlocked it. As I drove away, I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out from behind the cabin. The road felt endless. Dust followed me like smoke, and I didn't breathe properly until I reached pavement. I went straight to the nearest town and stopped at a gas station. I checked my truck, and there I found something taped under the back bumper. It was a small phone battery taped with black electrical tape, like someone planned to track or use it for something I didn't want to imagine. I removed it and left it inside a trash bin behind the station. That moment told me everything. Whoever had been around the cabin wasn't looking for help. They weren't lost migrants. They were someone who knew what they were doing. Maybe cartel people watching the area, maybe smugglers using that cabin region for something illegal. I didn't want answers anymore. I never went back to that cabin. I returned the keys by mail and never explained anything. For weeks later, I felt like someone might follow me, but nothing happened. The quiet I wanted so badly turned into something I feared. Today, when I think about that place, I don't imagine ghosts or creatures. I imagine a man hiding in the attic, waiting for the right moment. Someone who probably watched me every night I slept there. Someone who maybe planned something worse. The cabin still stands out there, but someone else can deal with whatever I escaped. I learned something from those days. Real fear doesn't come from things we invent in our heads. Real fear comes from real people, the ones who watch in silence, the ones who stay in the dark while you sleep, and the ones who don't need to make a sound to let you know they were there. I didn't expect to be out in the woods in late October, with the wind cutting through my coat like icy blades, trudging through mud that stuck to my boots in thick, unyielding clumps. I had been driving for hours, the old Chevy rattling over narrow back roads, until finally I spotted the small dirt track that led away from the main highway. The sky was a low, heavy gray, the kind of gray that made the trees look like black shadows reaching up to snatch anything that moved beneath them. I had a map, but it barely mattered. I was looking for a cabin that had been abandoned for decades, tucked just beyond an old, crumbling graveyard I'd stumbled upon in some forum post about forgotten places. The graveyard came into view first, half hidden behind a tangle of brambles and fallen branches. Rusted iron gates leaned at odd angles, their hinges frozen solid with rust. Some of the headstones were cracked, tilting at dangerous angles, with moss and lichen eating away at the inscriptions. Names, dates from the 1800s, worn down to nothing, stared back at me blankly. The air smelled damp and earthy, a thick mixture of rotting leaves and cold stone, and as I stepped closer, I noticed the ground was uneven, sinking in places as though there were hidden graves I hadn't seen. I walked slowly past the graveyard, trying not to trip on the gnarled roots snaking across the path. Every sound, my boots squishing through wet leaves, the low wind in the trees, a distant crow calling somewhere to the east, felt amplified in the silence. I had brought a flashlight, but I didn't turn it on yet. I wanted to take in the place first, and also the weak winter sun was still above the treeline. The cabin itself was a short walk past the graveyard, half hidden by a thicket of overgrown pines and scrub. When I saw it, I had to step back for a second just to process how completely it had been abandoned. The roof sagged in the middle, shingles missing, exposing the dark skeleton of the structure beneath. The wooden walls were weathered, gray, and rough to the touch. Some boards had fallen away entirely, leaving gaps I could see through. The small porch leaned dangerously to one side, and an old rocking chair sat tilted, half buried in leaves, as if someone had left it there in a hurry. I approached carefully. The door was stuck, swollen with moisture, and I had to tug at it with both hands to get it open. Inside, the smell hit me immediately: mold, wet wood, and something sour I couldn't place at first. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, a few torn newspapers from the 1950s, and shards of pottery. The air was heavy, pressing down, and I had to shake off a sudden chill as I stepped further in. There was furniture, though most of it was rotted beyond use. A small table leaned against the wall, half collapsed, and a mattress in the corner was nothing more than a tattered, damp mess. I moved carefully, not wanting to fall through the floorboards, which creaked ominously under my weight. The cabin seemed empty at first, silent except for the occasional whistle of wind through the cracks. But the deeper I explored, the more unsettled I felt. Something about being here, surrounded by decay and the silence of forgotten graves, made my skin crawl. I made my way to the back window, which looked out onto the edge of the graveyard. From here, I could see the sun dipping lower behind the trees, casting long, black shadows over the tilting headstones. The sight made my stomach tighten. It was beautiful in a harsh, lonely way, but it carried the weight of every person buried there, forgotten by time. I realized I hadn't noticed until now how overgrown the path between the cabin and the graves had become. Brambles scratched at my coat, roots tried to trip me, and I knew I'd have to be careful if I went back that way after dark. I decided to stay a bit longer in the cabin, partly to rest and partly because I was drawn to the place despite the unease. I set my backpack down and took out a small thermos of coffee. The metal cup rattled as I poured, steam curling in the cold air. I tried to shake off the feeling that I wasn't alone, that maybe someone had been here before me. But there were no footprints beyond mine, no signs of recent life. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck kept standing up. As night fell, the cabin's interior became a maze of shadows. The weak light from my flashlight threw the jagged edges of broken boards onto the walls in strange, shifting shapes. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows, and the branches of the pines scraped against the roof. I huddled in a corner, trying to keep warm. The cold seeped into my bones through the rotting floorboards, and I realized I could hear every little sound. The creak of a floor joist, a branch snapping in the distance, even the distant hum of a car on the highway miles away. Then I heard it, a low, dragging sound coming from outside, something wet and heavy moving across the leaves. My heart jumped. I strained my ears, but the sound stopped as quickly as it started. I waited, breath shallow, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer caught in the underbrush, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The cabin, already oppressive, felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing closer. Hours passed like that. I sat in silence, flashlight scanning, until the wind died down and the sound of the world faded. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I leaned back against the wall, feeling the rotted wood give slightly beneath me. I closed my eyes for a short rest, knowing I couldn't sleep properly but needing the break. When I woke, it was nearly dawn. The gray light of morning filtered through the windows, softening the shadows. I felt a strange relief. Surviving the night in that cabin alive was a small victory. I checked my watch. I had been there nearly 12 hours. My body ached, but my mind felt clearer. I packed my things, took one last look around, and stepped outside. The cold morning air was sharp and clean, and the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves no longer felt threatening but alive and real. I walked back past the graveyard, now seeing it in the light. The crooked headstones didn't seem as sinister, just old and lonely. The dirt path, previously hidden in shadow, was easier to follow. I thought about the cabin, how it had stood there for decades, weathering storms, neglect, and time, yet still holding itself together. It was a reminder that even in decay and abandonment, there is resilience. By the time I reached my car, the sun was breaking through the trees, casting warm light over the mud and leaves. I felt a calm I hadn't expected, a sense of closure. The night had been tense, uncomfortable, even frightening at times, but I had faced it and come out the other side. I drove away slowly, glancing back at the graveyard and the cabin. They would remain there, untouched by me, silent witnesses to the lives that had once passed through that place. And in some way, that felt reassuring. That day, I learned that fear isn't always about ghosts or monsters. It's about isolation, uncertainty, and the weight of history pressing down on the living. And I also learned that surviving that fear, facing it fully, leaves a kind of quiet strength behind, the sort that follows you long after you've left the woods and the graveyard behind. I didn't mean to be alone that week, but circumstances had a way of pushing me into situations I couldn't have predicted. It was the summer of 1998, deep in the rugged wilderness of northern Montana. I had been assigned to a remote ranger outpost near the Bob Marshall Wilderness, a place so dense with forest that the sunlight barely touched the forest floor most of the day. I was 29, a park ranger with 6 years in the service, accustomed to long stretches of solitude, but even I could feel the weight of the isolation settling in as I drove down the unpaved dirt road toward Cabin 12, the small ranger outpost tucked beside a swollen creek. The previous week, a new recruit had been assigned to join me, a young man named Marcus. He had been fresh out of the Army, 25, disciplined and alert in a way only a former soldier could be. He had insisted on accompanying me for his first assignment in the wild, and I had agreed, thinking the extra pair of hands would be helpful. But when we arrived at the ranger station, there had been an urgent dispatch calling Marcus away, some quick deployment to the National Guard. He left the night before, leaving me entirely alone. I hadn't realized just how unsettling that could feel until I turned the key in Cabin 12's rusted lock. The cabin was small, wooden, and aged, with a low ceiling and a fireplace blackened by years of fire. There were 2 rooms, a kitchen living area, and a bedroom separated by a thin wall. The furniture was functional but worn. A couple of chairs leaned slightly to one side. The table bore the stains of countless meals, and the small wood stove stood like a relic in the corner, its surface cold to the touch. I set down my pack and let the silence settle around me, broken only by the whispering of the pine trees outside and the steady murmur of the creek. The first night passed without incident, though the isolation made sleep uneasy. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wooden walls in the night wind, sounded sharper than it should have. I woke often, listening, scanning the dim moonlight through the thin curtains, waiting for something to appear. But nothing did, and eventually exhaustion won over. It was the second day that things began to feel wrong. I had gone out early, checking a small section of the forest for illegal hunting traps and signs of wildlife distress. The air was cool, the sun barely reaching the moss-laden ground. Birds called in the distance, but there were stretches of silence that felt almost unnatural. On my way back to the cabin, I noticed that the trail we had marked the previous week seemed disturbed. Small, subtle signs, footprints too large to be mine, snapped twigs, the smell of smoke lingering faintly in the air though no fire should have been nearby. My stomach twisted with unease, but I chalked it up to the forest being what it was: unpredictable, alive. That night, around 11, I heard it, the sound of someone approaching the cabin. It wasn't just the wind. I froze, listening as heavy boots crunched on the forest floor, moving deliberately toward the cabin. My hand instinctively went to the sidearm at my belt. My heart hammered in my chest, a mix of adrenaline and fear I hadn't felt in years. Whoever it was, they hadn't knocked, they hadn't called, they were just there. I grabbed the flashlight and slipped out quietly through the side door. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the forest in sharp, stark contrast. And then I saw him, a man probably in his late 30s wearing what looked like military surplus gear. His posture was rigid, alert, but he wasn't moving aggressively. He was observing, scanning. My rational mind screamed at me to stay calm, to call in my position via radio, but the batteries had died the week before, and there was no cell signal. I stayed hidden behind a large pine, keeping the beam on him. He was alone, carrying a large backpack, and his face was pale in the flashlight's glow. My first thought was Marcus. It had to be him, right? But then I remembered he had left hours before, heading back to the station with his gear. The man crouched beside the creek, staring intently at something submerged in the water. His movements were methodical, precise, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I didn't dare approach. Instead, I waited, watching as he finally stood, turned, and began moving toward the cabin. My pulse raced, and I had to make a decision. I couldn't outrun him in the forest at night, not without a weapon ready. But the logical side of me, trained in survival, knew I had options. I slipped back into the shadows, circling the cabin, watching for an opening. He reached the door, tested it lightly, and when it didn't give, he moved to a window. I could hear him muttering under his breath, low and sharp. Not words I could understand, just sounds. Panic gnawed at my chest, but I reminded myself of the training. Assess, observe, and wait for the right moment. The next hour passed like a nightmare. He tried every entry point, moving with deliberate care, never rushing. It became clear he wasn't after theft. He was searching for something or someone. I realized with a sinking feeling that the cabin was not just a temporary shelter in his mind. It was a target. The question was, why? Finally, he left, disappearing into the trees without even glancing back. I stayed in the shadows, shaking, listening to the crackle of the underbrush as he receded. My mind raced. Who was he? An escaped soldier? Someone after classified equipment? The thought of what could have happened if I had confronted him made my stomach turn. I spent the rest of the night awake, armed, listening, watching. At first light, I ventured outside, checking for tracks, signs, anything. His footprints were distinct, deep, leading away from the creek and dissolving into the dense forest. It was impossible to tell how far he had gone or if he intended to come back. I spent hours walking the perimeter, every sense alert, heart hammering. Days passed. I didn't see him again, but his presence lingered like a shadow. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I had to ration my food, water, and firewood carefully, knowing that leaving the cabin exposed could put me at risk. By the end of the week, I had survived, cautiously marking my position on the radio, finally able to contact the main station. A team arrived the next day, sweeping the area, but they found no trace of him beyond the tracks I had already documented. The experience changed me. I understood the wilderness differently now, not just as a place of beauty and solitude, but as a place that could harbor danger in silence, in a single pair of eyes watching you through the trees. I left Cabin 12 with more caution than I had ever carried before, realizing that survival wasn't just about skill. It was about patience, awareness, and respect for the unknown. When I returned to the main station, they asked if I had seen Marcus. I shook my head. I never saw him, never understood why that man had been there or what he had wanted. But I did know one thing. The forest had a way of testing you, of reminding you that even in a place of safety, you are never truly alone. And sometimes the most terrifying encounters aren't about what you see. They're about what you don't. The cabin remains, old and silent, standing at the edge of the creek, waiting for the next ranger. I drove past it years later, and the memory came rushing back. The sound of boots crunching through the underbrush, the smell of damp pine, the weight of eyes on me in the dark. It was a reminder that even in the most controlled, disciplined life, unpredictability lurks. And sometimes that is the scariest thing of all. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 29. I had recently entered a new business venture with a guy named Marco, someone I had met through the gym. We shared an odd sort of bond. Not quite friendship, but more of a mutual respect forged through early morning workouts, shared protein shakes, and an unspoken agreement that neither of us would slack off. We decided to take a break from the city for a weekend and explore a remote cabin I had stumbled upon online. It was tucked deep in the woods outside a small town called Ravens Hollow, a place neither of us had ever visited. The cabin's listing made it sound idyllic. Rustic, isolated, perfect for unwinding or brainstorming business ideas without distractions. When we drove up the winding dirt road, the forest seemed to swallow the path behind us. My old pickup rattled over the uneven terrain, and every so often, we'd hit a hidden rock or pothole that shook the frame. Marco drove like he owned the road, but even he slowed as the canopy of pine trees thickened, and sunlight barely pierced through. By the time we reached the cabin, the air had turned cooler, and a faint mist hovered around the treetops, giving everything a gray, muted look. The cabin was older than the listing had implied. Its wooden siding faded and weathered. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the small porch creaked under our steps. Still, it had a rough charm that appealed to both of us. I carried in the gear: backpacks, camping supplies, and a cooler packed with essentials. Marco unloaded his things silently, and we moved inside. The interior smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic like iron. The floorboards groaned under every step, and the single, small window in the living area framed the forest outside like a painting. After unpacking, we decided to explore the immediate area. The land behind the cabin dropped off into a shallow ravine, and we could hear the distant trickle of a stream somewhere below. The forest was dense, the kind of place where you could easily lose your bearings. Birds called occasionally, and a sudden gust would make dry branches snap, echoing like a gunshot. Marco, ever the fitness enthusiast, insisted we climb a ridge that overlooked the valley. The walk was tough. Underbrush clawed at our legs, and the air was thick with humidity. Sweat ran down my back, soaking the shirt I had convinced myself was breathable. Marco was ahead, moving with ease, but I kept pace as best I could. At the top, the view was stunning, but something about the stillness unnerved me. There was no wind, no sound except the distant stream and occasional bird call. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every small noise your own body makes. Marco didn't seem bothered, though. He pulled out a notebook and began jotting down ideas for our business, muttering figures and strategies under his breath. I wandered a bit further, taking in the trees, when I noticed something odd. The ground around a patch of trees looked recently disturbed. Not by animals, I realized, too organized, too deliberate. There were deep footprints, boot-sized, that seemed to lead toward the east ridge before disappearing. I mentioned it to Marco when I got back, but he shrugged it off. Probably hunters, he said, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. As the day wore on, the sun began to dip, and shadows stretched long between the trees. We returned to the cabin and started a fire outside on the small stone pit near the porch. The flames cracked and spat sparks into the dry air, and we sat on the rough logs we had dragged nearby. The forest darkened quickly, swallowing the ridges and paths in inky blackness. That's when I heard it, a faint, deliberate snap of a branch somewhere to our left. I froze. Marco noticed too, but instead of looking alarmed, he grabbed a flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing. The beam cut through the darkness in a narrow cone, illuminating gnarled trunks and twisted underbrush. I told myself it was probably a deer, a raccoon, or a coyote, but the sound came again, closer this time. Then another, followed by a faint rustle, like someone or something was moving with purpose. We decided to head inside. The cabin's door slammed shut behind us, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind tapping at the window. I checked the locks while Marco went to light the lantern. The inside felt smaller, tighter, but safer somehow. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Shadows seemed to shift along the walls, and every little creak in the roof made me flinch. Hours passed. We worked on our business plans and ate canned food, trying to ignore the sense of being watched. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard the faintest sound of dragging outside, right below the window. My stomach tightened. I whispered to Marco, who grabbed his flashlight again and approached the window cautiously. The beam fell on nothing but the yard and the edge of the forest. I swear I saw movement at the corner of my eye, but every time I turned, there was nothing. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay on the cot in the corner, listening. The forest seemed alive in a different way at night. The wind had picked up, rustling leaves, but every now and then, there was a silence that felt deliberate. Then, the sound of footsteps, slow, crunching on gravel. They circled the cabin. I nudged Marco, who finally admitted he had heard it too. We stayed awake, sitting back to back, flashlight and a small hatchet between us, listening as the sounds ebbed and flowed around the cabin. By dawn, the forest had returned to its normal rhythm. Birds chirped, and the mist had lifted. Relieved but still wary, we decided to leave. When we stepped outside, we saw tracks circling the cabin several times. Not small ones, they were large, booted, and uneven. Someone had been pacing, watching, waiting. I don't know how long they had been there, but we could tell it wasn't a random hiker or hunter. The drive back was tense. Every crunch of gravel under the tires made me flinch, and every shadow in the rearview mirror made me glance behind us. Marco didn't say much, but I could tell he was shaken. Once we reached the main road, the forest finally gave way to open fields and the city skyline in the distance. I felt a weight lift off my chest. We never went back to that cabin. I still remember it vividly. The way the floorboards groaned, the smell of old wood, the stillness of the forest at night. It taught me something I hadn't expected. No matter how prepared or fit you are, some situations in the wild aren't about strength. They're about awareness, intuition, and the understanding that sometimes just getting out safely is the best outcome. Marco and I grew closer after that weekend, not through shared ideas or gym sessions, but through surviving a situation that neither of us could control, together. Looking back, the fear was real, raw, and constant, but it also gave me a sense of clarity. I realized I wanted more control over my life, more awareness of the people and environments around me. And for that, I'll always remember that summer in Ravens Hollow, in that old cabin in the woods, where the forest felt alive in a way I can't fully explain, and where my business partner and I learned the unspoken truth of survival. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, but what you can't. I arrived at the old farm cabin in late September of 2019, just before the evenings started getting cold enough to see my own breath. I had found the place online, a small rented cabin outside a small town in northern Idaho. I chose it because I wanted quiet nights and open fields and some space away from my usual routine. I was 31 at the time, tired of city noise, and I thought a few weeks on a farm would calm my mind. The cabin sat near a long dirt road that split acres of corn on one side and empty pasture on the other. There was a larger farmhouse about half a mile away, but it looked empty most of the time, like someone only used it during harvest season. On the day I arrived, the sky was pale and dry, almost white, and there was dust in the air from tractors working somewhere far behind the corn. The cabin itself looked old but solid. The wood was faded gray, and the small porch sagged slightly at the front. There was a metal roof that tapped softly when dry leaves hit it, and the windows were cloudy like the glass had been there for decades. Inside, the place had the basic things I needed: a simple bed, a small table, an oil heater, and a single lamp that made a warm circle of light on the wooden floor at night. I brought my own food in a cooler, and I had a dog with me, a brown mixed breed that never barked unless something truly bothered him. The first few nights were quiet, exactly what I wanted. I slept early, woke early, took long walks along the dirt road with my dog, and listened to the wind move through the tall corn. I noticed deer tracks near the tree line and once saw a coyote in the distance, moving in that slow, careful way they do when they think they are alone. Nothing about those first days felt strange. The only sound at night was the insects and sometimes the distant hum of machinery. It was near the end of the first week that I started noticing small things that felt out of place. They were tiny details that maybe I should have ignored, but each one stuck in my mind longer than it should have. One morning, I found fresh tire prints near the side of the cabin going right up to the back door. But the road did not reach that far, and I had not heard any engine during the night. The prints were narrow, smaller than truck tires, almost like a small trailer or maybe an ATV. I looked around for any sign of someone else, but there was nothing except the quiet field and two crows sitting on the fence, watching. Another morning, I woke up earlier than usual and noticed my dog staring at the window. His body was stiff, ears forward, not growling but breathing heavier than normal. It was still dark outside, and the cabin was cold. I walked to the window, but I could not see anything except the faint outline of corn against the night sky. I listened, but there was nothing. No steps, no engine. Nothing but the soft rustle of plants moving in the wind. The dog stayed alert for a long time before he finally lay down again. Each day something else small would happen. A fence board lying on the ground that I was sure had been attached the day before. A rusty metal bucket moved from one side of the porch to the other overnight. Footprints in the dirt that didn't match mine. They were heavier, wider, and pointed toward the pasture, not the road. They sank deeper than my steps, like someone heavier or maybe someone carrying something. I told myself it was probably just a farm worker checking property lines or maybe kids messing around. But every morning I woke up feeling like someone had been near the cabin while I slept. The nights began to feel longer. I would lie in bed listening to the wind and trying not to focus on every little sound. Sometimes I thought I heard soft steps outside, but when I sat up and listened harder, everything went still. The air in the cabin felt heavy on those nights, like something unseen was pressing against the walls. I noticed my dog sleeping closer to me instead of at the foot of the bed. He never made a sound, but he wouldn't leave my side. One night, near the middle of my stay, I woke up because the metal roof made a single sharp tapping sound, loud enough to jolt me awake, as if something heavy had dropped on it. It wasn't like the sound of leaves or branches. This one felt deliberate, like a stone or maybe a boot scraping the metal. I sat in bed for a long time with my heart beating louder than the wind. I didn't move, didn't turn on the lamp, just stayed there in the dark. Eventually, the night went quiet again, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I climbed a small ladder I found leaning against the shed and carefully checked the roof. I didn't see anything unusual except a dent near the back corner, as if something heavy had hit it recently. The metal looked newer there, like it had been bent and then flattened again. I stepped off the ladder and tried not to think too much about it. I reminded myself the cabin was old. Maybe the wind had shifted something or a branch had fallen. But the trees were not close enough to reach the roof. A few days later, the strangest thing happened. I returned from a long walk and noticed the cabin door slightly open. Not wide, just enough to show a thin line of darkness inside. I was sure I had closed it when I left. There were no marks on the lock, and nothing inside seemed moved, at least nothing obvious. But the air smelled different, like dirt and old metal, the kind of smell that comes from being underground. My dog sniffed around the corners of the cabin for a long time before settling down, but he kept glancing at the door. After that, I started securing the door with a heavy chair each night. I checked the windows twice before sleeping. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The farm felt empty in the day but alive at night, in a way that made my skin tighten. I imagined someone watching from the corn, waiting for darkness. Every night I felt more exposed, even inside the cabin. The turning point came 2 nights before I left. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to control my breathing. My dog suddenly stood up, stared toward the back wall, and his fur slowly raised along his spine. Then I heard it. A slow, dragging sound outside, like something heavy being pulled across the dirt, close to the side of the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The dragging sound went on for several seconds, then stopped right below the window. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, loud and fast. I reached over and touched my dog gently, and I could feel him trembling. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, waiting for another sound, but everything went silent again. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake until I saw the first thin line of morning light through the window. When the sun finally rose, I walked around the cabin carefully, looking for any sign of what I heard. In the dirt, right under the window, there was a long mark, like something heavy had been dragged. It cut across the ground and continued toward the pasture, disappearing into tall grass. Next to the mark, there were footprints, deep and wide, and spaced just a little farther apart than a normal step, like whoever made them was tall or carrying something heavy. I stood there for a long time, staring at those prints, trying to understand what I was looking at. Something inside me finally decided it was time to leave. Not tomorrow, not later, but right then. I packed everything as fast as I could, loaded the dog into the car, and drove down the dirt road without looking back. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing except dusty road and endless corn. When I reached the main highway, I realized how tense my body had been for days. My shoulders hurt, my jaw felt stiff, and my hands shook on the steering wheel. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away. That night, I stayed at a motel, and for the first time in days, I slept deeply without waking up to strange sounds. I still think about that cabin, especially late at night when everything is quiet. I think about what I heard dragging below the window, what made those deep footprints, and why someone would be outside a farm cabin in the dark pulling something across the dirt. I never got an answer, and maybe that is what bothers me the most. The only clear thing is that someone was out there, close enough to touch the wall of the cabin while I slept, close enough to leave marks in the dirt. Nothing about that place felt supernatural or like a story someone would make up. It felt real because it was real, and that is exactly why I left and never went back. It was the winter of 2007 when I decided to take a week off from the city and head out to the mountains near Missoula, Montana. I was 29 at the time, and I had just ended a particularly draining project at work. The idea of a solitary cabin, far from cell service and the constant hum of urban life, sounded like salvation. I rented a small, unassuming cabin from a local who insisted it was perfect for people who need quiet. I didn't care much about the details. The pictures online showed a modest wooden cabin tucked into a dense grove of pines and firs, with snow already lining the roof when I arrived in early December. The drive there was longer than I expected. The road narrowed, twisting through the forest, and as I climbed higher, the snow became thicker, crunching under my tires. By the time I reached the last turn, I had to abandon the car and walk the remaining half-mile. The trees pressed in from both sides, branches heavy with snow, creating a low, gray canopy above me. My boots sank into the drifts, and every step left an echoing crunch that seemed far too loud in the quiet. The cabin itself was simple. A single-story structure with faded wooden siding, a small porch, and a single chimney puffing faint trails of smoke, suggesting someone had been there recently. I shoved the door open, the hinges whining in protest, and stepped inside. The air was cold and carried a faint scent of wood smoke, dust, and something slightly metallic. I brushed the snow from my jacket and boots and explored the small space. There was a wood stove in the corner, a tiny kitchen area, and one bedroom with a narrow bed. Everything was worn but functional. The windows were thick with frost, and the surrounding forest looked even darker from inside. The first night passed without incident. I chopped some wood, started a fire in the stove, and watched the flames crawl across the logs. Outside, the wind rattled the roof and whistled through the trees, but inside, I felt almost cozy. I had brought a small stack of books, a notebook, and some food to last the week. I didn't expect anything unusual. This was exactly the kind of solitude I wanted. The second day was when I started noticing small things. At first, it was subtle. The door latch was slightly shifted, though I was certain I had locked it the night before. I shrugged it off, assuming the cold had warped the wood. Later, I noticed that the firewood I had stacked neatly was slightly disheveled. I remember thinking, I must have knocked it over without realizing. But as the day went on, more signs appeared. The floorboards creaked in ways they hadn't before, not just under my own weight, but as if something else was moving. My dog, Max, a border collie I had brought along, began growling at the corners of the room and refusing to sleep near the door. By the third night, I was uneasy. I made sure to double lock the door, stack the firewood securely, and keep Max close to me. Around midnight, while the wind outside was picking up, I heard it, a faint scraping at the window. At first, I thought it was a branch, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. It paused, then shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of movement just beyond the frosted glass. My heart hammered, and I grabbed the small hatchet I kept by the stove. I didn't open the door. I just watched, Whatever it was, it disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Sleep was impossible after that. I stayed awake, listening to every snap and groan of the cabin, every rustle in the trees. The following day, I decided to investigate. I stepped outside, snow crunching under my boots, and walked around the perimeter of the cabin. The snow was pristine except for one set of tracks leading to the back of the woods, partially obscured by falling snow. They were too large to be Max's, too human to be an animal, at least I thought so. The tracks stopped abruptly near a dense clump of pines, as though whoever had made them had vanished into the trees. The next night, the sounds escalated. First, it was tapping on the roof, like someone walking carefully above. Then, faint footsteps circling the cabin, slow and measured. Max was frantic, barking and growling, trying to keep me between him and the windows. I stayed in the corner near the stove, clutching the hatchet and listening. The scraping returned, sharper this time, moving around the side of the cabin. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios, none of them good. Whoever or whatever was outside was clearly aware I was there. I spent the fourth day preparing. I barricaded the door as best I could, piling firewood against it and using a metal rod to secure the latch. I gathered stones and logs in case I had to defend myself. I realized I couldn't stay inside passively. I had to figure out what I was dealing with. I took a flashlight and went out in the afternoon, scanning the area carefully. The tracks were back, this time circling the cabin in a perfect loop, stopping just short of the tree-line. And in the snow, I found something that made my stomach twist. A small pile of stones, arranged in a crude triangle, with faint marks around them, as if someone had been kneeling there. I didn't wait to linger. I returned to the cabin immediately, locking everything up tighter than before. Night fell and the noises came back louder. At one point, I swear I heard someone trying the door handle. Then, a deep thud on the roof, followed by a heavy scraping sound like boots sliding across shingles. Max wouldn't stop barking, and I knew I was on my own. I stayed awake until dawn, exhausted and tense, gripping the hatchet. When the first light came, the sounds stopped, and the forest returned to silence. By the fifth day, I realized I couldn't continue like this. I needed help, but I had no cell signal, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I decided to wait until nightfall, then make a run for the main road where I could flag someone down. I spent the day keeping the cabin secure and moving only when necessary, constantly watching the tree line. The night was long, but finally, around 2 a.m., I gathered my courage and Max, grabbed my essentials, and slipped out the back door. The forest was darker than ever, the snow deep. I followed the tracks of my own earlier footprints, trying to make a straight path. Then I heard it, footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I froze, hoping I was imagining it. They stopped when I did, started when I moved. My heart was pounding in my ears. I ran, boots slapping against snow, Max racing ahead of me. I didn't look back until I reached the main road, where the faint glow of distant headlights told me someone was coming. I waved frantically, and the car slowed. It was a local couple on their way back from visiting family. I jumped into the warmth of the vehicle, shivering and exhausted. I told them only fragments, pointing vaguely to the cabin. They didn't press me for details, just shook their heads and offered coffee and blankets. I watched the cabin recede into the trees as we drove away, snow muffling everything, until it was just a shadow behind us. Weeks later, I returned to the area with local authorities. They found nothing in the woods, no signs of a person living nearby or hiding, just the tracks I had seen and the cabin, empty and silent. I never returned to Montana after that winter, but even years later, whenever I close my eyes, I can still see the cabin surrounded by snow and trees and hear those slow, careful footsteps circling just beyond the door. I first arrived in the heart of the Amazon in the middle of 1997, at 29 years old, with nothing but my old backpack, a weathered map, and a promise I had made to myself. To live for a month completely alone in the forest, relying on my own skills and wits. I had studied forestry in Brazil, and my experience as a logger in Mato Grosso gave me confidence. But the Amazon was a different kind of test. It was dense, wet, and alive with sounds and movements I couldn't immediately identify. The air was thick with moisture, clinging to my skin, and every breath tasted faintly of decay and vegetation. After a long trek following a narrow river, I stumbled across a small clearing where I could build my temporary home. The cabin I constructed was crude but solid. It was built mostly of fallen timber, vines, and thick palm leaves for roofing, carefully assembled to withstand the occasional heavy rainstorms that drenched the forest without warning. I made sure it had a small platform raised from the ground to keep the worst of the insects and water out, a small fireplace dug into the earthen floor, and a rudimentary rainwater catchment system. I had been meticulous. I knew the jungle didn't forgive mistakes. The first week was exhausting but peaceful. I spent my days walking along the river, chopping wood, setting up snares for small game, and fishing with a handmade spear. I quickly realized that every sound had meaning. The splash of water indicated a fish, the rustle of leaves meant an animal was moving nearby, and the deep hum of insects sometimes signaled approaching rain. Nights were the hardest. Without the sun to mark time, the jungle seemed endless, alive with movement, and impossible to read. My flashlight only illuminated a small circle. Beyond it was darkness so thick it felt solid. One night, during a particularly heavy downpour, I heard something that immediately made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, a snapping of branches far off the river, but it grew louder, deliberate, slow. My instincts screamed at me, honed by years working alone in forests. I grabbed my machete and peered into the shadows outside the cabin. For hours, the storm masked everything, and the rhythm of the rain made it impossible to tell how close the sound was. I forced myself to stay alert, moving quietly, scanning for any sign of movement. The next morning, after the storm passed, I examined the perimeter of my cabin. Something had been there. Deep footprints pressed into the softened earth, larger than any animal I had seen in the area, with a distinct pattern. Deep heel marks and claw-like gouges at the tips. Whoever or whatever had been there had moved slowly but deliberately. The thought of a human in these parts was more terrifying than any predator because I knew that people who wandered this remote part of the forest were often desperate or dangerous. I spent the next few days reinforcing my cabin, sharpening my machete, and setting simple alarms made from strings and cans around the perimeter. I hunted with more caution, always keeping my back to a tree line, and I began to notice signs of movement. Broken branches, displaced leaves, and faint traces in the mud that suggested someone had been observing me. I didn't sleep more than a few hours at a stretch. Every sound became a warning, every shadow a potential threat. One morning, I woke before dawn to find my fishing spot disturbed. My spear was missing, and there were footprints leading to the river and back. Whoever had done this hadn't left carelessly. They had marked their presence. I felt a chill crawling up my spine as I realized I was no longer alone. And in a place where no one could hear a scream, that realization was terrifying. I knew I couldn't wait for them to come closer. I packed the essentials: water, some dried fish, a few days' worth of rice, and my machete. I decided to move to a secondary location I had scouted days before, a narrow ridge overlooking a bend in the river where I could see anyone approaching from a distance. The trek was dangerous. The jungle had reclaimed every step of the path I thought I had marked. Vines tangled around my legs, sharp thorns tore at my arms, and the constant sound of insects pressed in on my ears. But I moved silently, alert to every snap of a twig, every rustle in the brush. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was high, and the canopy opened just enough to let light fall on the platform I built. I set up a basic shelter, dug a small trench for drainage, and marked several escape routes in case I needed them. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of control. The ridge gave me a vantage point over the river. From here, I could spot anyone approaching long before they reached me. The following nights were tense. The forest never truly slept, but the ridge gave me some peace. One night, around midnight, I noticed a movement far down the riverbank. A figure crouched low, moving with careful precision. My heart pounded, but I stayed still, watching. The figure lingered for hours, never approaching too closely, never retreating fully. It was a person clearly experienced in moving through the forest. Whoever it was, they were patient, skilled, and dangerous. I realized then that I was being stalked. Over the next week, I adapted to their presence. I moved quietly, hunted only when necessary, and avoided leaving trails near the water. The stalker never made a direct approach, but their influence was felt constantly. I began to leave false trails, sometimes backtracking over my own footprints, even creating dummy shelters in case they tried to follow me directly. Survival became a mental game as much as a physical one. Finally, after almost 3 weeks, I found an opportunity. The stalker had left a pattern, moving mostly along the river at night. One night, I rigged a simple alarm along a false path I had created, then hid on the ridge with my eyes fixed on the riverbend. Around midnight, the figure returned, cautious as ever, stepping right into the trap. The loud clatter of my makeshift alarm rang through the forest. The figure froze, cursed under their breath, and then bolted in the opposite direction. I didn't pursue. They knew the forest better than I did. But I had a plan. I waited another 2 nights. Then, under the cover of heavy rain, I packed my essentials and retraced a concealed path I had discovered to a small landing where a guide had agreed to pick me up. The stalker never followed, likely deterred by my precautions and the risk of exposure. When I finally stepped onto the boat, feeling the river carry me away, I realized how fragile life was in the jungle. The Amazon had tested me, not just physically but mentally. I had faced fear in its rawest form, and I had survived because of preparation, patience, and vigilance. Looking back, I understood that the danger I faced wasn't from the forest itself, but from the other humans who shared it. The jungle can kill in many ways, through hunger, disease, or accident, but encountering someone with intent is another level entirely. I had entered the Amazon seeking solitude, and I had found it, but only after proving I could protect myself. The months that followed were filled with reflection and stories I told quietly, to myself and to close friends, never exaggerating. The forest had shown me its beauty, its brutality, and the subtle, constant threat of other humans. And I survived. I didn't plan on staying in the cabin for more than a weekend. It was the summer of 2008, and I was 29, working a desk job that left me restless and hollow by the time Friday came. I'd grown up around the woods, spending every possible weekend hiking with my father in the pine forests outside of Ashwood, Oregon. But city life had made me forget the raw, untamed feeling of the forest. The cabin was in a remote stretch of forested land, about 20 miles from the nearest town, reached only by a single dirt road that twisted through thick pines and ancient firs. The owner had posted it online, rustic, off-grid, perfect for disconnecting. I didn't care about perfect. I cared about getting away from people, phones, deadlines, and everything that felt like it was squeezing the air out of me. The first drive in was uneventful but tense. The sun was low, a molten orange sinking behind the thick line of trees, and I felt that electric hum in my chest, the kind you feel when you're about to cross into something untamed. The cabin appeared suddenly, a dark shape among lighter trunks, almost hidden. It wasn't big. 2 small rooms, a tiny kitchen, and a loft. The wood smelled old but dry, seasoned by decades of weather. There were no modern luxuries, no electricity, no running water, but that was exactly why I'd chosen it. The first night was unnerving. I'd arrived in the late afternoon, unloaded my car, and explored the surrounding area. The forest was alive with sound. Crickets, the distant tap of a woodpecker, the low whistle of wind through the trees. Yet, every time I stepped beyond the cabin's small clearing, there was this other sound, subtle but persistent, like something heavy moving far off, broken sticks snapping under weight that didn't belong. My mind tried to dismiss it. Wildlife, I told myself, maybe a deer, a bear, but the noise was deliberate, or at least it felt deliberate. I set up a small fire in the metal ring outside and cooked my dinner. The stars came out as the sky bled into dark blue and black. I'd been alone in the woods plenty of times, but there was a difference here. The isolation was complete. No distant roads, no passing cars, no hum of the city. Just me, the trees, and the darkness pressing in. I stayed up later than I usually did, sitting on the split log bench outside, listening. The snapping noise returned, closer this time. I froze, firelight catching the glint of something moving just beyond the treeline. A human? An animal? Couldn't tell. The shape melted away when I squinted toward it. Sleep came fitfully. I kept the cabin door bolted, though I had no real lock, just a rusty latch. I kept one eye open, dreaming of shadowy figures moving between trees. In the morning, the unease didn't fade. There were signs outside the cabin that hadn't been there the day before. Footprints, large, almost human in shape, leading through the undergrowth but never quite to the cabin itself. I followed them for a short distance, but they disappeared, as if whoever or whatever made them had vanished into thin air. The days passed with slow, tense rhythm. I chopped wood, gathered water from a nearby stream, and kept watch over the treeline. Each night the noises became bolder. Heavy steps, rustling branches, the occasional distant shout that echoed across the hollow. One evening, after a sudden thunderstorm, I returned to the cabin soaked and cold. My firewood was scattered across the yard, as if something or someone had been there while I was gone, handling it. I could see no tracks, no footprints, but the pattern of disturbance was deliberate, almost mocking. I began sleeping with a large hunting knife by my side, and I kept a small hatchet on the floor beside the bed. My mind oscillated between reason and fear. It was probably a local poacher, or some teenagers out playing in the woods. Yet, the way the disturbances followed me suggested intelligence. They were not random. Every time I went outside, something watched, moved, shifted. I started setting traps around the cabin. Not lethal, just nooses and strings tied to cans that would rattle if disturbed. I caught glimpses of movement at night. A shadow passing along the treeline, too tall to be a deer, too fluid to be a bear. I never saw faces, never saw anything fully. One morning, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. The door latch had been lifted from the outside, the door slightly ajar. No footprints, nothing to indicate how anyone could have approached without leaving a mark. Inside, I checked every corner, every shadow. The kitchen drawers had been rifled through. My food, my gear, even my knife had been moved slightly from where I'd left it. Whoever or whatever had been inside knew exactly how I lived, exactly where I kept everything. I made a decision to leave, to drive straight through the dirt road back to town and call it over. But when I stepped outside, I saw the unmistakable tracks. Human, large, booted, circling the cabin, never quite approaching, but always present. I noticed for the first time that each time I moved, they mirrored me. If I chopped wood near the fire ring, The next morning, twigs and bark were disturbed in the same pattern. If I walked along the stream, the earth along the bank was flattened, pressed down. Whoever was out there had the patience to stalk me silently, carefully, without ever making themselves known. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the cabin, knife and hatchet in hand, eyes on the treeline. The forest was alive with movement, rustles, and the faint snap of branches. At one point, I swore I saw two shapes emerging slowly from the shadows, walking on the periphery of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The figures stopped, crouched low, and then vanished as suddenly as they appeared. By the third day, I realized I couldn't continue hiding in fear. I decided to end it safely. I would wait for dawn, drive out, and never return. I packed my car, leaving nothing behind, every step careful, every movement deliberate. I waited until the first light stretched across the trees, pale and weak, casting long shadows. Then I started the engine and drove, watching the treeline, expecting to see them follow, expecting some sign that they had been right behind me. Nothing followed. The tracks in the dirt slowly disappeared behind me. The forest returned to quiet. I drove straight to the nearest town, filled up on gas, bought water and snacks, and called my father to tell him I was on my way home. By the time I reached the outskirts of civilization, I could breathe again. The fear that had gripped me so completely in those 3 days began to loosen its hold. Looking back, I understand now that it wasn't ghosts or mythical creatures or some storybook terror. It was human. Someone had been watching me, studying my patterns, testing how I would react to the isolation. Maybe they were a hunter, maybe someone who thrived on the fear of others, but it didn't matter. I had survived, and I had learned something important. Fear is not always about what's unreal. It's about what's patient, deliberate, and real. Something that can wait, move silently, and strike only if you let it. I never returned to that cabin. The memory of the tall shadows, the careful tracks, the way the forest itself seemed to close in around me, stayed with me for years. I've traveled to forests since, but I always carry a knife, always watch the treeline, always assume someone or something is moving just beyond my sight. And that fear, that tension, that raw awareness of being alone in the wild, it has kept me alive more than any weapon ever could. It was late October of 1998 when I found myself driving down a narrow, mud-slicked forest road in northern Maine. The rain was relentless, hammering against the windshield in a steady, unbroken rhythm, blurring the dim beams of my headlights into a smear of white. My car, an old blue Subaru that had seen better years, slipped and squelched over the muddy ruts, the tires leaving tracks that were quickly swallowed by the downpour. I'd been on the road for hours, coming back from a photography job in Bangor, and the GPS had long since lost signal. I wasn't worried at first. I had a small cabin rented through a local lodge, the owner promising a quiet retreat far from any cell towers or neighbors. At least that was what I thought. The forest was thick, the kind of dense, evergreen woods that seemed to absorb sound. Even the rain, loud and constant, seemed to dull as I pressed deeper into the trees. Shadows clung to the roadside like dark, restless animals, and the occasional flash of lightning made the wet trunks gleam like polished ebony. I hadn't seen another car in nearly 2 hours, and a creeping sense of isolation began to settle in my chest. The kind of isolation that makes you hyper-aware of every scratch of a branch on the metal roof of your car, every small splash as a puddle hisses under the tires. Eventually, I spotted the cabin. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a steep roof that sloped sharply into the darkness. Smoke curled weakly from the stone chimney, barely visible against the pouring rain. My relief was immediate. I parked on the uneven, muddy ground in front of the cabin and killed the engine, listening to the sudden silence after the roar of the tires. The rain still fell, relentless, but inside the cabin, I thought it would feel safe. The front door was heavy and solid, with a rusted iron latch. I pushed it open and was hit with the smell of damp wood and a faint, lingering scent of oil from an old stove. The cabin was empty, but it wasn't cold in the way a deserted building often is. The wooden floor creaked under my boots as I stepped inside, taking in the single room, roughly 30 feet long, with a small stone fireplace at one end and a narrow loft above. A table and a few chairs sat near the corner, and on the far wall, a row of shelves held dusty, half-empty cans of food and a few glass jars. The windows were small and streaked with rain, the storm outside making the glass rattle in its frames. I dropped my bag near the door and went to the fireplace, pulling out the small, rusted matches I'd found in the kitchen drawer. The wood was damp, but I managed to get a small flame going. The fire sputtered, coughed, and then finally caught, sending a warm, flickering light across the room. The cabin seemed to breathe with the movement of the flames, the shadows stretching and recoiling along the rough walls. Outside, the rain continued, the wind making the trees groan and snap. I unpacked a few essentials and decided to explore a bit, just to make sure I knew the layout. The loft was reached by a narrow wooden ladder, worn smooth by years of use. The floorboards there creaked violently with each step, and I had to move slowly to avoid the sound echoing too loudly through the cabin. The loft was small, with just enough space for a mattress and a few old blankets. A single window looked out into the darkness, showing nothing but the rain-streaked forest. I placed my bag down and sat for a moment, listening. The storm had grown louder, and every few seconds, a loud clap of thunder rattled the cabin like an announcement from the sky. As night fell, the storm worsened. The wind whipped around the cabin, tearing at the eaves and sending sheets of water sliding down the roof in heavy rivulets. The fire in the fireplace flickered and hissed as the gusts pressed against the walls. That's when I noticed it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping against the side of the cabin, but then I realized it was a slow, deliberate knocking coming from the far end of the building. My heart rate spiked. I waited, thinking it might be the wind, but the knocks came again, 3 sharp, measured hits. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and moved toward the back door, trying to keep calm. The cabin had a small shed attached, and I feared it might have been animals, maybe a raccoon or something larger. I forced myself to the door, hand trembling, and swung it open. The rain immediately lashed my face, soaking my jacket. I shone the flashlight over the muddy yard, the wet trees, the small clearing around the cabin. There was nothing, no movement, no tracks besides my own. Shaken, I went back inside, thinking I had imagined it. But as I settled back in front of the fire, another sound made me stiffen. The faint crunch of footsteps on the wooden deck outside. They were slow, deliberate, and the way the boards groaned suggested a heavy weight. My stomach turned. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a neighbor, a hiker lost in the storm, but that didn't feel right. The cabin was supposed to be isolated. I spent the next hour sitting close to the fire, listening to the storm and the occasional movement outside. Every sound made me tense. The wind rattling a window, the drip of water from the eaves, the faint creak of the deck. Then, I noticed something else. The mud outside was being disturbed. Fresh footprints pressed into the soft earth, circling the cabin slowly. They weren't animal prints. They were human, large, heavy, and wet. I knew I couldn't wait it out. I grabbed my car keys and bag and ran to the car in the pouring rain, slipping and sliding across the mud. The footprints followed me briefly, but there was no one in sight. Heart hammering, I started the engine and slowly drove down the forest road, rain blinding me. I didn't look back. The cabin disappeared into the darkness, the storm swallowing everything. The next morning, the rain had stopped. I returned with the lodge owner, explaining what had happened. They were shocked. Apparently, the previous week, someone had been squatting in the area, living in abandoned cabins during storms, and had gotten aggressive if anyone approached. My private retreat had been in the path of someone desperate, possibly dangerous. The owner helped me retrieve my belongings safely, and we found signs of recent occupation. Discarded cans, footprints, and even a small fire pit outside, nearly extinguished from the rain. It was a terrifying experience, but it ended with relief. I had survived the storm and the unexpected human threat, and the cabin was finally secured. The fear lingered in my mind for months afterward, the thought of those footsteps circling in the dark, but it also left me with a strange clarity. I realized how quickly isolation could turn dangerous, how small and vulnerable you are when the elements and other people combine in ways you never expect. I never returned to that area, but every time it rains hard, I remember the cold, wet mud under my boots, the relentless downpour, and the way the forest seemed to press against the cabin like a living thing. I survived, yes, but I never forgot. I never liked the cold much, but in the winter of 2013, I found myself driving through northern Minnesota in a beat-up old Ford F-150, my breath fogging the cracked windows. I was 28, had a few years under my belt working odd jobs, and had decided to take a break from the city, from the constant hum of people and deadlines, and rent a cabin far off the grid for a week. It was advertised online as secluded, peaceful, perfect for solitude. The pictures were rustic but charming. An old log cabin tucked into dense pines beside a frozen lake. I didn't care about charm, though. I cared about isolation, about getting away from the pressure that had been building in my chest like a storm for months. The road ended in nothing but snowpack tracks, the kind where your tires sometimes slip and you have to dig your way through drifts. I remember gripping the steering wheel tight, the truck rattling under me, the only sound my breathing and the occasional crunch of snow beneath tires. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller in person, older. The logs were dark with age, some cracked. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and the chimney had what looked like a spiderweb of cracks running along it. But it was exactly what I wanted. The silence was thick, heavier than I expected, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or the distant bark of a dog somewhere I couldn't see. I parked near the front, got out, and my boots sank into the snow. The cold bit at my cheeks, and my hands stung as I fumbled with the keys I'd been given. The door protested when I opened it, the hinges squealing like they hadn't been oiled in years. Inside, it smelled of dust and damp wood, and I noticed immediately the thin layer of frost along the corners of the floorboards near the windows. A small, wood-burning stove sat in the corner, and an old pile of firewood was stacked haphazardly beside it. I set my bag down and took it all in. A small kitchen with chipped cabinets, a single bedroom with a mattress that sagged like it was sunken into the floor, and a tiny bathroom with a cracked mirror. There was no heat except the stove, no cell service, and no neighbor for miles. I spent the first day trying to settle in, stacking wood, lighting a fire, and cooking canned beans over the flames. The sky turned pink and then dark, the sun slipping below the trees faster than I expected in December. By nightfall, the cabin was warm, and I had lit every candle I could find. That's when I started noticing little things. A noise from outside, like the scrape of metal across wood. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized my firewood pile was shifting slightly on its own. I dismissed it, told myself it was snow settling, or maybe a small animal. I tried to sleep, but every little sound felt exaggerated, amplified by the complete silence of the forest. The next morning, I woke to footprints in the snow outside the cabin. At first, I thought maybe I had left them myself, but there were far too many, circling the cabin, some leading toward the woods. I froze, staring at them through the window, stomach sinking. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. I thought about leaving, but the truck wouldn't start. The battery was dead, and the nearest town was miles away, the roads likely impassable after the last snowfall. I spent that day moving cautiously, trying to prepare the cabin defensively, stacking logs near the door, breaking a broom handle to use as a makeshift weapon. I started keeping the stove fire burning constantly, even during the day, for warmth and some sense of control. Night fell again, and the scraping returned, louder now, circling the cabin. I didn't dare look outside. The darkness seemed alive, pressing against the walls. I kept imagining someone out there, waiting, watching. By the third day, I could feel the isolation gnawing at me. Every noise, every shadow seemed magnified. I discovered the cabin had an old cellar with a trapdoor under the rug in the kitchen. It was cold and smelled of mildew, but I realized it could be a hiding place if I needed one. I stocked it with candles, some canned food I hadn't opened yet, and a blanket. By that night, I barely slept. Every time I dozed off, I would jerk awake to a scraping or the faint crunch of snow just outside the walls. I started leaving a candle lit by the window, hoping whoever or whatever was outside would see it and leave, though I knew it probably wouldn't work. On the fourth day, I tried to make a run for the truck. The tracks outside hadn't moved, which meant either whoever was out there had left and returned, or they were hiding, waiting. I moved slowly, keeping my back to the wall, checking windows constantly. The moment I stepped out, the snow crunched loudly under my boots. I froze, scanning the tree line. Nothing. The tracks continued in the direction of the forest, deeper than I could see. I ran to the truck, tried the ignition, and it turned over immediately. Panic and relief collided in my chest. I didn't stop to think about the truck battery anymore. I just drove. I didn't go far, maybe a few miles, before the truck got stuck in a snowdrift. I had to push, dig, and heave it free. By the time I finally reached a plowed road, I was exhausted, trembling from adrenaline and cold. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, a small cluster of buildings that looked like they had been forgotten by the rest of the world. I pulled into a gas station, the lights warm and harsh, and felt the first real sense of safety I'd had in days. I called the police, explained where I had been, and when officers came, they found footprints leading away from the cabin, deep into the woods. They didn't find anyone, no signs of forced entry, just the tracks. They said it was likely someone had been living off the grid nearby and stumbled across the cabin, possibly watching me, then moved on when I didn't respond. They never caught anyone. Even after I returned to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, close enough to touch me if they wanted to, waiting for the right moment. I never went back to the cabin, and I made sure to avoid remote rentals after that. But sometimes, late at night, I picture those tracks in the snow, circling the cabin, the dark shapes between the trees, and I feel that same cold pressing against my skin, reminding me of how close I'd come to something I didn't understand. In the end, the cabin was abandoned, the threat gone, and I survived. I survived because I stayed aware, because I prepared, because I didn't freeze under the weight of fear. And that's the lesson I carried with me. Fear can be paralyzing, but careful attention, quick action, and a little courage can get you through even the darkest, loneliest place. I never returned to that part of Minnesota, but I keep the memory, as sharp and vivid as the icy air that bit my face that week. A reminder that sometimes survival isn't about luck. It's about paying attention, moving fast, and never letting your fear control you. I didn't plan on being alone in the cabin that weekend, but circumstances had a way of pushing me into solitude. It was late October 2012, and I'd decided to take a short trip into the remote mountains of northern Arizona, near the Mogollon Rim. I was 29, an amateur photographer, and had a weakness for quiet spots where the world felt far away. The cabin wasn't fancy, just an old wooden structure that had been rented out through a small local lodge. Rusted hinges, a sagging porch, and a faint smell of mildew greeted me, but I didn't care. The isolation was perfect. The first day was calm. I spent hours walking through the thick pines, snapping photos of the early autumn leaves catching the late afternoon light. The sun dipped low behind the cliffs, turning everything gold and red. By nightfall, the forest had settled into a heavy, almost tangible silence. I lit the fireplace, boiled some water for coffee, and settled into an old armchair with a worn blanket over my legs. Around midnight, I heard it. At first, I thought it was a coyote, a low, almost guttural growl, followed by a scraping sound against the outside wall of the cabin. The sound wasn't precise, like claws against wood, but uneven, as though something large was pressing against the logs with deliberate weight. I froze, listening. The wind rattled the trees, and I told myself it was just the old cabin settling. But then I heard it again, this time closer, a soft thump followed by something brushing against the porch railing. I stood and peered through the window. The moon was just bright enough to outline the dark shapes of trees, but nothing seemed out of place. No coyote, no deer, nothing. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a stray dog. My chest thumped harder, but I went back to the fire, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Couldn't sleep. Every small noise seemed amplified in the quiet. Around 2 in the morning, a heavier thump sounded again, this time against the cabin door. Something large, too large for a coyote, was pressing against it. My stomach dropped. I had a hunting knife in the kitchen drawer, a small caliber rifle in the corner, and yet, holding the knife, I felt suddenly powerless. I couldn't see anything outside, but the shadows seemed to move unnaturally. The next few hours passed in tense silence. I didn't want to leave the fire to check the door, and I didn't want to leave the safety of the cabin either. Around dawn, the noises stopped, but I didn't sleep. When morning came, I forced myself outside, trying to find tracks. The ground was wet from a light drizzle, and I saw prints, strange prints. Not exactly human, not exactly animal. The paw-like marks were too large for a dog or coyote, but the strides suggested something that could move upright if it wanted to. I shrugged it off. It had to be a large animal. But as I packed up my camera gear to explore further into the woods, I noticed something odd. Deer tracks ran alongside the strange prints, but the strange prints veered off sharply, almost as though something had been following the deer, moving with precision and intent. By late afternoon, I was deep in the woods, trying to shake the unease from my mind. That's when I saw it, or rather, glimpsed it. A movement at the edge of my vision, a figure crouched low between 2 trees. My first instinct was to assume it was a hunter, but no, the way it moved was wrong. Too fast, too fluid, and the body seemed to shift in ways human anatomy didn't allow. I froze. I didn't dare make a sound, barely breathing. It paused, and I caught the faint outline of a head that seemed human but with subtle distortions. The shoulders were too broad, the limbs slightly off, elongated in ways that made it hard to identify exactly what it was. I didn't run, couldn't. I held the camera out instinctively, and it moved its head toward me, as if it knew I had noticed. Its eyes, when they caught the fading light, were the wrong color, like pale amber, glassy. It tilted its head, then, without warning, dropped down on all fours and disappeared into the trees. My chest ached. My legs were trembling, but I forced myself to retreat slowly toward the cabin. I didn't want to give it the satisfaction of hearing me panic. That night, I barricaded the door as best I could. Every sound outside made my stomach drop. Around midnight, the scratching started again. But this time, there was a rhythm to it, like something testing the integrity of the structure. Then came the low growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls. I stayed in the corner with the rifle, shaking. I kept my finger off the trigger, not wanting to provoke it. Hours passed. The first light of dawn came, and the noises finally faded. I cautiously stepped outside and found something terrifying. Marks all around the cabin. Deep gouges in the wood, broken branches, and footprints. Not human, not exactly animal. Something had circled the cabin, studying it, studying me. The prints led off into the trees, ending abruptly, as though whatever it was had melted into the forest itself. I packed everything immediately, not daring to linger. As I left, I kept glancing over my shoulder. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw movement. Something crouched in the tree line, watching, but when I focused, it was gone. I drove hours down the winding mountain roads, finally reaching a small gas station in a town at the bottom of the rim. The clerk noticed my pale, haggard look and didn't ask questions. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Even then, I wasn't sure how to explain it. Back in my apartment, I tried to convince myself it was stress, exhaustion, or imagination. But months later, I found pictures on my camera of blurry, almost motion-streaked images of something crouched among the trees, humanoid but wrong. And a detail I hadn't noticed until zooming in. The face, pale and hairless, eyes glinting unnaturally. My stomach twisted. I had seen it with my own eyes. I never went back to the Mogollon Rim. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't stay in isolated cabins. Every time I'm alone in the woods, I remember the way it moved, the way it studied me. I don't know what it was. Some kind of animal I'd never seen or something else entirely, but I know one thing for certain. It was intelligent, deliberate, and it was real. The rational part of me wants to dismiss it, to tell myself I saw a trick of the light or a rare predator behaving unusually. But the prints, the scratches, the photographs, there's no denying it. Whatever it was something that should not be there, something that watches, waits, and adapts. And it's still out there. I sold my camera gear shortly after and tried to move on with my life. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself thinking about the forest, the cabin, the shape in the shadows. I know I'll never forget that weekend. And I know that if I ever return to those woods, I'll be facing the same creature again. The memory is burned into me, a warning I can't ignore. I survived, yes, but I left part of myself behind in those trees, and I'll never go back to retrieve it. I had been driving for nearly 6 hours, the gravel road stretching endlessly ahead, flanked by thick pines that blocked out the weak sunlight of late October. I was looking for solitude, a place where I could clear my head, far from the noise of the city and the constant hum of other people's lives. I had heard about an old cabin somewhere in the mountains of western North Carolina, abandoned for decades, that people used as a sort of private hideaway. Nobody I knew had ever gone there. Nobody I could call for help either. I liked it that way. The GPS signal was weak, dropping in and out, leaving me navigating by instinct more than anything else. The forest around me was quiet, almost oppressively so, with only the occasional crow or rustle of leaves disturbing the stillness. The sun was sinking lower when I finally spotted it. A small, sagging structure almost swallowed by the undergrowth. The cabin's wooden siding was gray and weathered, streaked with dark stains from years of rain. The roof was crooked, some shingles missing, and the windows were dark with grime. The porch sagged under its own weight, and a single rocking chair sat abandoned, slightly tilted, as if someone had just left it there. I parked a little down the slope and approached on foot. My boots crunched over leaves and twigs, the sound startling in the eerie silence. Up close, the decay was more pronounced. The door hung loosely on one hinge, and when I pushed it, it creaked loudly, echoing in the empty room. Dust floated in the weak shafts of light that filtered through the dirty windows. The air inside smelled of mildew and dry rot. The cabin was small, barely more than 2 rooms, but every surface told a story. Broken furniture lay scattered, an overturned table, a cracked rocking chair, and a few wooden crates with their lids warped open. The floorboards were uneven, and I had to step carefully to avoid putting a foot through the rotten wood. A layer of dirt and grime covered everything, and the faint scuttling of rats in the corners made me tense, though I reminded myself this was just part of being in an abandoned place. I decided to explore the back room. As I stepped inside, I noticed the remnants of what must have been a living space. A rusted metal bed frame, a mattress frame that sagged with time, and some faded curtains that barely hung from the rotting rod. In the corner, a small stove was caked in soot and used for decades, yet it looked almost like it had been abandoned mid-meal. I ran my fingers across the dusty surfaces, leaving trails where the dust stuck, and my mind wandered. Who had lived here? Why had they left? I moved back to the main room and opened the window to let some air in. That's when I noticed it. Tracks in the dirt outside, barely visible, but unmistakable. They weren't human footprints. They were larger, broader, and deeply pressed into the wet earth. They led away from the cabin, deeper into the forest, then disappeared. My heart started to pound. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but there was something odd about the spacing and depth. Shaking off the unease, I decided to stay the night. I had packed a small sleeping bag and a flashlight. As night fell, the cabin transformed. Shadows lengthened and stretched across the walls, and every creak of the floorboards made me jump. The wind picked up outside, making the broken shutters bang against the walls. I tried to read, but every sound made me pause. The forest around the cabin felt alive, though I knew it was just the wind, the trees, and the occasional animal. Around midnight, I woke to a noise that was different. Not the wind, not the trees. Something heavy, dragging along the side of the cabin. I froze, my flashlight in hand, trying to see through the darkness. The sound came closer, deliberate, slow. I crouched low, listening. There was a smell now too, metallic, like iron, faint but unmistakable. My mind raced. Could it be someone else? A hunter? Or worse, I hadn't seen another car on the way in, and the area was isolated. I waited, holding my breath, and then I saw it through the window. A shadow, large and bulky, moving around the side of the cabin. I couldn't make out details, but it was definitely human-sized. The dragging sound stopped abruptly. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I thought about my options. Running out into the dark forest was dangerous, but staying inside meant being trapped with whoever or whatever was outside. I grabbed my phone, praying for a signal. There was none. The flashlight's beam shook in my hand as I considered my next move. Then, slowly, deliberately, the shadow moved away. I didn't wait to see where it went. I climbed out through the back window. It was the only way I could get out without being seen, and ran downhill, my legs cutting through underbrush and fallen branches. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until the cabin was no more than a dark silhouette behind the trees. Then I heard voices in the distance. Human voices calling. I followed them, my feet slipping on mud and leaves, until I stumbled into a small dirt road. There, an old man with a truck was waiting. I explained, breathless and frantic, about the cabin and the noises, and he nodded slowly, understanding immediately. He had been warned about that cabin, he said. People had tried to stay there before. Some had disappeared for hours, sometimes days, wandering the woods in a daze, only to be found miles away, disoriented and terrified. He gave me a ride back to the nearest town, and I never went back. Even the thought of that place makes my skin crawl. But I kept thinking about the tracks and the dragging sound. The truth is, it wasn't supernatural. There was someone or multiple people using that cabin as a hideout, possibly for illegal activities. My gut told me that they had seen me, maybe even noticed me approaching, and were testing the perimeter. I had just been lucky they weren't there when I opened the door. A week later, I drove back through the area in daylight, curiosity gnawing at me. I didn't stop at the cabin itself, but I scanned the forest as I passed. Everything seemed quiet, normal, yet deep down, I knew the cabin was still there, waiting, hidden among the trees. The world could forget it, but I never would. The smell of mildew, the creaking boards, the shadows in the corners, they were burned into my memory. I learned something important that night. The scariest places aren't haunted by ghosts or fairy tales. They're haunted by the real, by the unknown, and by the people who use isolation to hide things they don't want anyone to see. From that day on, I never sought solitude in the woods again. I realized that the peace I was chasing was fragile, and there were places in the world where danger hides quietly behind stillness. And sometimes, surviving isn't about facing a monster directly. It's about recognizing the warning signs and getting out before you become part of the story yourself.